Hello, welcome to the San Francisco Opera Guild's preview of one of opera's most romantic masterpieces, Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin, starring two new San Francisco opera debuts as we welcome to the stage Eugenia Muraveva as Tatiana and Gordon Bittner as Onegin. My name is Benjamin Osgood, and I serve as the Vice President of Community Outreach on the Board of Directors for the San Francisco Opera Guild, whose award-winning education programs reach over 64,000 students annually in more than 200 schools. Today, we are thrilled to welcome back to this evening's speaker, Derek Katz, an associate professor of music history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, from which he received his PhD in 2000. He also holds a degree from Harvard and has studied at the Free University of Berlin on a Fulbright fellowship. A specialist in Czech music, Dr. Katz has published on 19th century chamber music, as well as to Janacek and his world, as well as studying mid-20th century institutional support for professional string quartets in the United States. At any time during the preview, you can press the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to leave your questions with us. And we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions and messages during the Q&A portion following tonight's preview. Derek, it's great to see you again, and you are no stranger to San Francisco Opera. How many years have you been doing these?
I actually looked this up recently, and I've been coming since 2010, and I believe this is the 8th opera for which I've been fortunate enough to do a preview. Most, but not all Slavic. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here, even if virtually. And Benjamin, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for hosting me.
We're thrilled to have you. Thank you so much. And with that, I will hand the virtual stage over to Derek for tonight's opera preview.
Thank you again. And again, delighted to be here. Let me just do the inevitable awkward fumbling as I share my screen and show you slides. And there, okay, wonderful. So, yes, as Benjamin told you, the subject of today's preview is Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin, a great personal favorite of mine, but I think an opera which doesn't work quite in the way that all other operas do. Yesterday morning, I was in Los Gatos, and a very candid audience member said to me, you know, I'm very fond of Eugene Onegin, but what I really love is Italian opera, and Eugene Onegin isn't that. And I think that's right, and to a certain extent, my subject for today is why it isn't exactly that, and what it is, and how we might listen to it in that particular context. So first, some just basic data, as I'm sure a well-educated audience of the sort that we have out there virtually knows, the opera Eugene Onegin is based on the novel in verse Eugene Onegin by Alexander Pushkin, which was published serially in the same manner that Dickens' novels were between 1824 and 1829, which is also the time period in which the action of both the novel and the opera are set. So for what it's worth, we jump forward to the 1880s when the first performances of Tchaikovsky's opera were taking place. This was sort of more or less a generation and a half, 2 generations back, but more or less within living memory, a relatively contemporary period. I think it's sort of a standard move to suggest that Pushkin has the same status in Russian culture that Shakespeare does in English-speaking culture, or that perhaps Johann Wolfgang von Goethe does in German-speaking culture. So I think we just sort of need the basic premise that we cannot overstate the importance of Pushkin. And the somewhat problematic reception of Tchaikovsky's opera, both in his time and ours, has quite a lot to do with the enormous status that's attached not just to Pushkin as an individual, but to Eugene Onegin as an individual work. So Tchaikovsky in 1877 was actively searching for an opera subject. And we might stop for a moment and ask ourselves, why opera for Tchaikovsky? Well, Tchaikovsky was in an interesting sort of double bind. In Imperial Russia, there were very few outlets for professional musicians, and in particular, there was very little in the way of public music life, even in the large cities. So the most obvious outlets were those things that were supported and patronized by the imperial court: ballet and opera, obviously two genres closely associated with Tchaikovsky. So the idea that he would wish to establish himself through opera makes sense. Although we also have to remember that the Imperial Opera was an Italian opera company. The singers were Italian, most of the repertoire was sung in Italian. St. Petersburg famously is where Verdi's La Forza del Destino was premiered. So although opera was an outlet to public performance and prestige for Tchaikovsky, he also knew that Russian opera was going to be of a much lower status than Italian opera, or for that matter, Russian spoken drama. So nonetheless, by 1877, Tchaikovsky had composed three operas, each one slightly more successful than the last, and he felt correctly that he was poised to make a bigger splash if only he could find the right subject. According to Tchaikovsky's own account, which we have in multiple sources, the idea of setting Eugene Onegin, came in a social setting. He was at a dinner party at the home of one Elizaveta Lavrovskaya. She was a leading mezzo-soprano soloist at the Imperial Opera, and apparently she just made the offhand comment, Pyotr Ilyich, why do you not set an opera on Eugene Onegin? And Tchaikovsky, according to his own account, again said, that's ridiculous, that wouldn't make an opera, nobody could do that. So apparently he goes home, he thinks about it some more, he goes off to an inn, he has dinner, and suddenly he realizes, no, this is a fantastic idea. So he rushes home, he attempts to find a copy of the novel. Now, this is where I have a little bit of trouble understanding the story. It is my understanding, as I've attempted to convey to you, that this novel is extraordinarily central to Russian culture. Why was it that Tchaikovsky didn't have his own copy and couldn't find one for 3 days? I don't know. Seems a little mysterious. Nonetheless, some days later, he tracks it down, he rereads it, he's so excited he cannot sleep. After this sleepless night, he gets up the next morning and dashes off a scenario. So that is to say, not an actual libretto, but Tchaikovsky selected the episodes from the action of the novel that he wished to include in his opera to be. So the next stage is he repairs to the country estate outside Moscow of his friend Konstantin Shilovsky. He's sort of a talented amateur. He acted, he wrote, he wrote poetry, and so Shilovsky and Tchaikovsky collaborate on the libretto for the opera Eugene Onegin. Now, most of the words, and this is important, are actually by Pushkin. So when I say that Shilovsky and Tchaikovsky are collaborating on the libretto, mostly what they are doing is slicing out, recopying verses verbatim from Pushkin's novel in verse and rearranging them, putting them in the mouths of characters to form an operatic libretto. There are some moments in the opera that are poetry that are actually by Shilovsky or by Tchaikovsky, but by and large, it's straight Pushkin, mediated only by being excerpted and rearranged. So for the most part, reception of this opera tends to sort of posit a notional Russian audience that's very, very familiar with Pushkin's poetry, and then compare the opera to the novel, usually in ways that do not flatter Tchaikovsky. Before getting into that, I thought we could actually listen to a little bit from the opera. I have two motives for doing this. One is I just think it's a nice thing to sprinkle the musical examples sort of throughout the talk, so you don't have to wait till the end. Okay, three reasons, I'm sorry. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is I think this is an unbearably charming little snippet from Soviet television. And reason number three is that I want to return to this particular melody later in the talk. So getting it in your ears now, I think, will be to our advantage. So again, this is it's a little snippet from 1958 from Soviet television. It's the Moscow Art Theater Jubilee for Olga Knipper, Anton Chekhov's widow. And as part of that Jubilee, the two leading tenor soloists at the Bolshoi Theater, at the Bolshoi and Kirov theaters in the sort of the second quarter of the 20th century, come on stage in their evening dress and sing an arioso from Eugene Onegin. So as we will discuss in just a moment, the tenor role in Eugene Onegin is a young poet named Vladimir Lenski, and he is in love with a young girl named Olga. So there's an arioso that starts, "How I love you, Olga." So obviously this is a perfect thing to be converted into a tribute to a different Olga. So I hope you will enjoy this.
Я люблю вас, Ольга. И всегда мы будем вас любить. Мы вам приносим поздравление. Вы нам дарите вдохновение чистой души своей Карелии. Как мы любим вас, благодарны вам за светлое искусство и за подлинные чувства, что игрой вы восхищали с этой сцены в этом зале. Поздравляем вас и желаем вам счастливых долгих лет, на радость нам и всем друзьям, кто в час вечерний к вам спешит. Где так цветет сердца благоухающий вишнёвый
So I can't see anyone's faces, but I hope that you enjoyed that. And by the way, in my excitement, I forgot to mention the tenors' names. Those Ivan Kozlovsky on the left, Sergei Lemeshov on the right. Lemeshov will be back in just a moment. So let's get back to Pushkin's novel. But first, and I hope this doesn't seem too frivolous, I would like to tell you a joke. And the joke comes courtesy of the late Richard Juruskin, great musicologist, longtime preview lecturer for the San Francisco Opera Guild. There's an alternative world where this event is taking place a few years ago, and he is here instead of me. But in lieu of his actual physical presence, I offer to you Richard Juruskin's Pushkin joke. And it goes like this. We have to imagine that we are in a classroom in Russia. Teacher's looking out at a sea of schoolboys, and he is quizzing them on important dates in Russian history. And he says to them, "Children, what happened in 1799? Dead silence. Nobody moves. He looks out, no hands, no offers. He says, "Children, I'm so disappointed. How can it be that no one here knows that 1799 is the birth year of Russia's greatest poet?" He said, "But that's okay. Let us move on to the next important date in Russian history. Who can tell what happened in 1812? Again, silence. Finally, after some waiting, one hand tenderly goes up in the back of the room. The teacher's relieved, says, "Yes, Sasha, please tell us what happened in 1812. And Sasha says tentatively, "Pushkin's bar mitzvah?" Once again, I can't tell if you liked the joke or not, but I hope that you did. Anyway, again, courtesy of Richard Juruskin. So let us now move on to the more serious stuff. If we are to discuss the novel and its relationship to the opera, this gives me an excuse to do one of the things which I am charged to do in these previews, which is to tell you the plot, the events, the characters and events that pertain, in this case, both to the literary source and to the musical treatment. So first, our characters. We have Eugene Onegin, in Tchaikovsky's words, a cold dandy. He is bored with the social whirl of life in St. Petersburg. He inherits an estate from his uncle and moves out to the provinces, where he becomes equally bored with rural life. There he meets and befriends the poet whom we have already met, Vladimir Lenski. Lenski, again, he's very young. He's 17 or 18. He's just returned from Germany, full of enthusiasm for the poetry of Friedrich Schiller. And Lenski is in love with a neighbor girl, Olga. We don't know much about Olga, but apparently Olga and Vladimir play chess together. Here are a few words from James Phelan's translation of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, I think very funny treatment of this particular episode. They steal away whenever able, and sit for hours, seeing naught, above the chessboard, deep in thought, their elbows propped upon the table, where Lenski with his pawn once took, bemused and muddled, his own rook. So, as I say, we don't know a whole lot about Olga. She's young, she's pretty, but crucially, she has an older sister, Tatiana. Tatiana loves books. That's her main characteristic. You see here depicted in Lydia Timoshenko's illustration, clutching a book. There are other illustrations in which her love of books is made even more obvious. Clearly, she really loves books. All of these illustrations come from either late imperial or Soviet editions of the Pushkin that are illustrated. So, Tatiana meets and falls in love with Onegin. So at this point, we've got the four people that we care about. We have two couples, one actual couple, Lenski and Olga, who are already in love and presumably headed towards marriage. Another couple, which is a potential couple, Tatiana and Onegin. Tatiana is in love with Onegin. We don't know how Onegin feels about it yet. So this sets up the events, and I would say that there are 5 events that we care about. And we can classify them into 2 letters, 2 dances, and 1 duel. Now, I don't know, I was kind of going for a 4 weddings and a funeral kind of thing there. I think it's not quite as punchy, but that's the idea. So let's go through those 5. So event number 1 is letter number 1. Tatiana sits down, another sleepless night, and writes a letter to Onegin confessing her love. Onegin receives it, but rejects her, telling her politely but coldly that he's not capable of the type of romantic love that she deserves. He can only offer her a kind of brotherly love, and that he hopes that she meets somebody worthy of her. This leads us to event number 2, dance number 1, which is that Lenski drags Onegin to Tatiana's name day party. Onegin is expecting this to be a quiet family affair, and is quite dismayed to find out that, in fact, all of the families in the area have come, and it is, in fact, a kind of full-dress ball with presentations. Onegin is very unhappy with this and manifests his displeasure by both flirting with and dancing with Olga, who, of course, is Lenski's intended. Absolutely no one is happy about this, and this leads to event number 3, here depicted in a famous watercolor by Ilya Rapin, which is that Lenski challenges Onegin to a duel, which he is honor-bound to accept, despite the fact that he shows up late and insults Lenski by bringing his servant as a second. He somewhat accidentally, fatally wounds Lenski in the course of the duel, thus ensuring that there will be no tenor aria in the 3rd act of the opera. So that's event number 3. Which brings us to the conclusion of both the novel and the opera, in which sometime later, Onegin, having traveled reasonably widely, returns to St. Petersburg, where he once again encounters Tatiana at a ball. So we're back in St. Petersburg, we're back at St. Petersburg dances, and this is, of course, event number 4, dance number 2, another ball. So here, Onegin realizes that actually he's been in love with Tatiana all along. And so what does he do? Of course, for symmetry's sake, he writes her a letter. And again, for symmetry's sake, Tatiana admits, after some hesitation, that yes, she does love him, but no, she is married. I'm sorry, I left out that part. When Onegin sees Tatiana again, she's already married to a general. So she know she's given to another, she will be faithful to him, and then that's really the end of the story. We hear the general spurs in the distance, he appears, and the novel abruptly ends. So this plot has many virtues, including both simplicity and symmetry, but the general consensus is that the actual events are not what make the novel great. We care about Pushkin not because we care about the interactions between Onegin and Tatiana, but we care about the way in which the story is told. So first off, Pushkin's brilliance manifests itself in the sheer virtuosity of telling a long, complicated story in a very consistent and rigorous verse form, the famous Onegin stanza. 14 lines, iambic tetrameter, a particular rhyme scheme. By the way, I'm sure some of you know Vikram Seth's novel Golden Gate, set out here, uses the Onegin stanza in English. I'm sure there are other examples. And then in addition, I think, well, no, it's okay, we can stay there. The actual events play a relatively small portion, or they constitute a relatively small portion of the novel. Most of the novel is given over to the musings of the narrator, who is an obvious stand-in for Pushkin himself. There's commentary on Russians' taste in literature. There's commentary on the current state of Russian poetry. There's meta-commentary on the narrator, on the narrative itself, rather. The narrator slash Pushkin knows that he's writing a book and reminds us of that all the time. Let me give you one more example from James Phelan's translation of the novel. This is the end of chapter 3, in which we are at the point of maximum suspense. Onegin has received Tatiana's letter. Tatiana wonders what his response will be. Onegin appears, and this is how it goes in the poem. But finally she rose forsaken, and sighing started home for bed. But hardly had she turned and taken the garden lane, when straight ahead, his eyes ablaze, Eugene stood waiting, like some grim shade of night's creating, and she, as if by fire seared, drew back and stopped when he appeared. Just now, though, friends, I feel too tired to tell you how this meeting went, and what ensued from that event. I've talked so long that I've required a little walk, some rest and play. I'll finish up another day. Quite the anticlimax, no? And again, remember, this was a serial publication. You got to the end of chapter 3, and you had to wait many months to find out what Onegin's reaction was. So obviously, all of this is lost in the opera. We lose the commentary, we lose the meta-commentary, and the characterization is not as sharp and precise as it is in the novel. So, for instance, I've already mentioned that we know that Tatiana loves books. Well, that's about the extent of our knowledge, if we know her only from the opera. In Pushkin's novel, we know exactly which novels she has read, which authors she prefers, which characters she sympathizes with, and those things place her to Russians in the 19th century in a very specific generational and social context. And it's that type of, again, very precise social specificity, which is so brilliant in Pushkin, and for better or for worse, is absent in Tchaikovsky. Although, again, I see this as a difference rather than a problem. Which, again, I feel that, first off, we are not that notional Russian audience. Outside of Russia, in more recent days, I think it's a very reasonable statement that the opera is known much better than Pushkin's novel. This is story, Eugene Onegin, is known almost exclusively as an opera outside of Russia. So a comparison with the novel, I think, is not completely necessary unless we think it leads to greater understanding or a different way of listening to the opera. And in any case, I mean, why should fidelity to the literary source be our primary criterion, or even on the list of criteria for whether we think an opera is successful or not? So, again, I think this comparison is probably a little overdone. Again, this sort of possible discomfort with Tchaikovsky's opera comes from a few places. I think one place that it might come from has to do with Tchaikovsky's own relationship to the characters in Eugene Onegin. And here, in the interest of time, I'm just going to flip past a couple of slides. You can look at that one. That's fine. That's the Tchaikovsky monument instead in front of the Moscow Conservatory, now the Moscow State Tchaikovsky Conservatory. If you're interested in music education in 19th century Russia, ask me in the Q&A. But so let me get back to where I thought I was. The biographical episode which gives some people pause is that Tchaikovsky apparently identified so closely with the characters in Eugene Onegin that they actually affected one of his major life decisions. And that is Tchaikovsky, and again, this is by his account, was so moved by his identification with and sympathy for characters in particularly Tatiana in Eugene Onegin, that it led him to get married. Now, getting married for Tchaikovsky was something that was done against the firm advice of his brothers and friends, and of course, against the urgings of his own sexual orientation. Nonetheless, Tchaikovsky, in a sort of too bizarre to be true incident, in 1877, received a letter from a young woman, formerly a student of his at the Moscow Conservatory, whom he barely remembered, named Antonina Milyukova. Tchaikovsky inevitably saw himself as Onegin, the somewhat older man receiving a letter from a younger woman, and Tchaikovsky, again, sympathizing with Tatiana, did not want to break Antonina's heart the way that Onegin broke Tatiana's heart. And incredible as it seems, for this reason, he resolved to accept the proposal and get married, which, alas, went very badly for all concerned. I think, we tend to see photographs of Tchaikovsky from later in his life, when he's more older, more distinguished, white bearded. I think it's nice to see the somewhat younger Tchaikovsky, and there are actually 3 photographs of him from 1877, the year of Eugene Onegin's composition. You saw one of them earlier. Here are the other 2. That's a kind of, I think, poignant pair, one with his very unhappy bride, the other with the young man with whom he was actually in love, Joseph Kotek. So, and this is what causes people to accuse, or what has caused some Russian critics to accuse Tchaikovsky of having a sort of naive and sentimental relationship with the characters in the novel. And so, fair enough in some sense. He did have that type of identification, as he wrote in a letter, quote, "From my earliest years, I have always been deeply moved by the profoundly poetic quality of Tatiana's character after Onegin appears." And as I've always mentioned, he had no great fondness for the character of Onegin, again, describing him as a cold dandy. So, okay, but on the one hand, and this is a point I'm lifting from Richard Cheruskin, this type of expression was a conventional way for composers to express themselves to patrons and supporters. So this is a way for composers to make their intentions legible to people who are not themselves trained in music. So the idea that Tchaikovsky would speak of characters in his operas if they were real people is not something that should strike us as unusual or requiring explanation. And then, in any case, even if we were disturbed by that sort of thing, who really identified closely with characters from Eugene Onegin? That would be none other than Alexander Pushkin himself. As I already told you, Pushkin basically inserted himself into the novel as the narrator and seems to have imagined Onegin as an actual acquaintance. Here we have 2 non-literary products from Pushkin's pen. On the left, a sketch of the character Eugene Onegin by Pushkin, and on the right, a kind of doodle depicting Onegin and Pushkin leaning over the banks of the Neva, the river Neva in St. Petersburg together, which, is just a little doodle in the margins, but Pushkin had to have either been thinking of Onegin as a real person or of himself as a fictional character. So, again, Pushkin, Tchaikovsky seem to be rather on the same page in that regard. So once again, it's very interesting biographically, doesn't bother me in the least. Let us move on now to the sort of opera proper. And one of the things I'd like to do is, in addition, again, to worrying this question of the relationship between literary source and musical treatment a little more, is to start setting up a kind of typology of characters and arias. And basically what I want to suggest is that we can go through the opera thinking of some characters and some music as being kind of conventionally operatic, that is, being about the beauty of the human voice, about vocal display, about the expression of emotion through music, And then there are other characters and music associated with those characters that are more about understanding words and about having a more literary presentation of vocal music. So as a way of easing into this, and again, I hope not trying your patience with the tedium of my voice more than necessary, inserting a second musical example. So this again is going to be a vintage clip from Soviet television, and will once again be the wonderful tenor Sergei Lemeshov singing Lenski's big aria from the second act. So first off, Lemeshov. So for what it's worth, there are recordings of Russian singers going all the way back to the late 19th century. People were bringing wax cylinder recorders to Imperial Russia to record the great singers of the court opera. So we know what Russian tenors sound like for a long time. And the Russian tenor is a very distinctive, or uses a very different distinctive type of vocal expression, something which in recent generations, to the best of my knowledge, has been completely lost. So Lemeshov, I feel, is not just an exemplar of vocal technique in general. I mean, my goodness, the rhythmic freedom, the soft singing, the flexibility of timbre, it's extraordinary, but it's also a kind of plangent nasal sound that for me is very distinctive of the early 20th century Russian tenor, and again, a sound that we just don't otherwise have access to. That's that. The aria itself, as I say, comes from the second act. This is from just before the duel. Lenski is waiting for Onegin to appear. He is accompanied by a minor character named Zaretsky, whose only role is to sort of supervise the duel. And Lenski is sharing his final thoughts with us. So it's subtitled, you'll get those. But my basic feeling is, this is a real opera aria. That you get a little introduction, which poses a question and sets the scene. Then the rhythm picks up. We get the melody proper, which is in the voice. It rises up in the tenor register and then drops down, giving us a sense of the beauty of the different registers of the tenor voice. It becomes somewhat more agitated in the middle. We return to the original theme later on because we like it so much. The voice becomes steelier, and as the text becomes more impassioned, it rises in pitch and volume. This, again, is all stuff that I think of as sort of conventionally operatic. Look, I mean, this is music that I fell in love with before I had any idea what Lenski was singing about, before I'd read the novel, before I knew the plot of the opera. I just loved the sound of the tenor voice in this music. And I can't, ask people to nod, but I suspect that I'm not the only one here that has felt that way about it. So here we go. Sergei Lemeshov with Igor Mikhailov, Lenski, and Zaretsky.
Ну что же, кажется, противник ваш не явился. Явится сейчас. Но все же это странно мне немножко, что нет его. 7-й ведь час, я думал, что он ждет уж нас. Куда вы удалились, весны моей золотые дни? тьме таится он. Нет нужды прав судьбы закон. Подоли я стрелой пронзенный, или мимо пролетит она. Все благо бдения и сна, приходит час определенный. Благословенный день забот, благословен и тьмы приход. Блеснет за утро луч денницы, и заиграет яркий день. А я, быть может, я гробницы сойду в таинственную сень. И память юного поэта поглотит медленная лето. Забудет мир меня, но ты, Ольга. Скажи, придешь ли, дева красоты, слезу пролить над ранней урной и думать, он меня любил. Он мне единой посвятил рассвет печальной жизни бурной. Ах, Ольга, я тебя любил, тебе единой посвятил рассвет печальный жизни бурной. Ах, Ольга, я тебя любил. Сердечный друг, желанный друг, приди, приди, желанный друг, приди, я твой супруг, приди, я твой супруг, приди, приди. Я жду тебя, желанный друг.
again, so I hope that you enjoyed that. It's up on YouTube. Just put in Lemashov and Lenski and it'll pop right up. There's also an audio-only recording of the entire opera from 1937 with Lemashov as Lenski, which vocally is even more spectacular. Okay, but I must move on. So what kind of opera is Eugene Onegin? So, as is already clear, the Pushkin literary source is already generically unusual. It's a novel, but it's also a poem. And I would argue that the Tchaikovsky musical setting is also simultaneously an opera, but also something which is very similar to, but not exactly identical to, an opera. Well, first off, Tchaikovsky himself was very clear that he was displeased with many of the conventions of opera production of the time, and he didn't want his Onegin to be sucked into that world, the world of the state theaters in Russia at the time. So this is a quote from a letter to the composer Taneyev. "It may well be that you are right in saying that my opera is not good theater. My reply to that would be that I don't give a damn for the theater. I wrote the opera because one fine day I felt an indescribable urge to put to music everything in Onegin that asks to be put to music, caring little about whether there was any action or stage effects. If that is what you find in your Aida, for instance, then I assure you that not for anything in the world could I now write an opera on such a subject. I need people, not puppets." And Tchaikovsky was also more than willing to sacrifice a large audience and the associated financial rewards for his dramatic principles. This is now from a letter to his publisher, who had a vested interest. Quote, "It seems to me that this opera will be more successful in private houses and perhaps even on concert platforms than on large stages." And indeed, Tchaikovsky wrote Onegin to be performed by students at the Moscow Conservatory, which in fact is where it was premiered. Again, a quote, "I wrote it for the Conservatoire because I do not need in this work a large theater with its," everything from here on emphasized, "its dull routine, its conventionality, its undistinguished producers, its nonsensical staging, even if it is opulent, its flapping machines instead of conductors, etc." There, Tchaikovsky on the opera theater. And Tchaikovsky had a plan. He hoped that the public would gradually get to know the opera and then create a demand that would justify a production by the state theaters. And this is more or less what actually happened. Onegin first reached audiences not through stage productions, but through published sheet music. So there were versions both of the opera, the complete opera, and of what would become the best known excerpts, dance music, vocal music, from the opera, transcribed, reduced for solo piano for players of differing levels of abilities. So these publications of the piano reductions, all of these things came out and reached sheet music buyers before the opera had received a professional staging. So Onegin's first audiences weren't audiences in the sense that we would expect, with people sitting and listening to people sing. Instead, there were people sitting at home at the piano, learning the music, through the tactile experience of playing it with their own fingers, which I find very interesting, particularly since domestic life is such a big deal in the opera and in the novel for that matter. So, and again, Tchaikovsky's plan worked. The demand was created. The opera was presented by the state imperial theaters in both Moscow and St. Petersburg. And to Tchaikovsky's surprise and delight, was actually quite a success. And spoiler alert, has remained on the world stages as a beloved part of the operatic repertoire ever since, obviously. So if Tchaikovsky was, in some sense, intending Onegin as sort of anti-Aida, how does this work in practice? So Tchaikovsky sometimes referred to Onegin as an opera, but not always, and that's not what's on the title page. The title page says Eugene Onegin, lyric scenes, not opera. So lyric in Russian has basically the same connotations that it does in English. It can refer to lyrical in the sense of singing. It can refer to lyric poetry. It can refer to the lyrics of a sung text, or the text that is sung for a song or an aria or what have you. So I think, when Tchaikovsky calls these lyric scenes, he's thinking both that these are lyrical scenes because they're sung, they're musically beautiful, but also in the literary sense that the scenes are expressing emotions in the way that lyric poetry expresses the emotions of the notional poet. So that's lyric. And then scenes, of course, at one level just reflects the traditional division of the acts. The opera has 3 acts broken up into 7 scenes. But I think this is also scenes in the sense of episodes or excerpts from a known story. Now, don't worry, you don't need to have read the novel or have any familiarity with it to appreciate and enjoy the opera. It's a perfectly coherent and satisfying dramatic narrative arc all by its lonesome. And yet, I still think there's a sense of, again, scenes from written for audiences that already knew the story, already knew who the characters were. That's what Tchaikovsky did in this scenario, right? He went through the novel and cherry picked the bits that he thought, how did he put it? That asked to be set to music. So there's that. So I also think that in breaking it up into scenes, these scenes have a very strong sense of place. Pushkin's novel makes a big deal of moving between the urban public realm, social balls in St. Petersburg, the ballet in St. Petersburg, to the domestic and rural. And that is something which I think is retained in the opera. That again, it's important. Are we in the countryside? Are we in the city? Are we in the domestic realm? Are we in a more public realm? And so Pushkin obviously does this through descriptions. He tells us where we are. He describes people. He describes places. He describes ballet dancers and so forth. So, how does Tchaikovsky do this? Well, Tchaikovsky creates the contrasts from musical texture. So if we're, as we are at the very beginning of the opera, Act 1, Scene 1, out in the countryside, how do we know what's going on? We hear it in the orchestra. Well, actually, we see it on stage. There's a chorus of peasants. They're doing peasant things. They're singing about doing peasant things. It sounds like folk music. We know exactly where we are. A little later on, we see a shepherd. He's playing a pipe. It's then imitated by the oboe in the orchestra. So fair enough. That's all very straightforward, right? Folk music equals rural life. But we're not always seeing the peasants or seeing the shepherd. And even when we're not, when people are doing other things, singing about other things, we still hear fragments of the folk music of the shepherd's pipe, even when we don't see the peasants or we don't see the shepherd. So there's a way in which the orchestra is constantly reminding us of where we are. I think that's important. And by the way, sorry, I've been asked, are you supposed to be seeing a blank screen? Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't get a nice tidy slide for this portion of the discussion. I'm sorry about that. So then the other side of that is like, okay, well, and then what about when we're in the city, when we're at these dances? Well, obviously we get dance music. 3rd act, back in St. Petersburg, there's a big ball. There's a very famous mazurka. Great, fabulous. I'm sorry, in the 3rd act is a very famous polonaise. The very famous mazurka is in the 2nd act. Get to that in a moment. So, okay, so again, and it's the same sort of thing. Even when people aren't actually dancing, when they're talking about other things, the orchestra is still dancing. It's still reminding us that that musical texture is the texture of life. It's all about social dance music. And again, the reason why I think this might be worth getting into is because the critical moment in the opera comes right in the middle, in the 2nd act, and that is Tatiana's name day scene. And I think it's very important that this is the one place or the one moment that doesn't fit neatly into those two categories. On the one hand, it's rural. We're still in the provinces. We're on the estate of Tatiana and Olga's parents. But despite the fact that we're in that estate, it's still a kind of public event, right? There are people from all over the place. They're dancing. They're doing the same things that they would do at St. Petersburg Ball. And to a certain extent, that's what causes all the trouble. And Onegin thought that he was going to be in this domestic private realm, and lo and behold, it turns out to be a public event. So, we could just say, well, once again, it's dance music. We got the waltz, we got the mazurka. That's all very nice. It's doing the same things. But I think there's a real tension between the refined 3rd act St. Petersburg Ball and the kind of country imitation of it in the 2nd act. So that's something to which we might want to give a little bit of thought. So as I've been talking about this scene setting, I've been emphasizing the role of the orchestra. And I'd say to a certain extent, the orchestra, in addition to telling us where we are, usurps the role of the narrator to some extent. So, and this is something I'm sure you're familiar with other operas, particularly those by Wagner, and that is that the orchestra is capable of telling us things that the characters are thinking, even when the characters themselves are not singing or performing stage action. So I'm going to cherry pick the best example of that, which comes from the duel scene. So this is immediately after the aria that we saw a little while back. So Lenski and Onegin, pistols loaded, are now walking slowly towards each other. There's no other action on stage. Neither of them is singing. And yet we know that Lenski is thinking of Olga. How? Because the orchestra, the upper woodwinds, are playing the melody of Lenski's Arioso, that very music that we heard sung at the Chekhov Jubilee earlier in the hour. So just very quickly, let me remind you of that tune. Let's listen to the beginning of, sorry. There we go. Remind you of the Arioso melody, and then I'll immediately go to the moment in the duel scene when the woodwinds are playing the same tune. So I hope this is going to be okay. This next set of excerpts comes from a DVD where the volume level is a little low. I've got it cranked up as high as it goes at my end, so I think it's going to be all right. So first the Arioso, Love for Olga, then the duel scene, same melody, but no singing. Okay, I hope that made sense. Again, not being able to see your eyebrows, I don't know if they were raised or not. And you know, there are other examples. I've, of course, picked the most obvious one for my own selfish purposes. So the first point is, again, for those that are concerned about the relationship between novel and opera, I think that Lenski as a character is an example of Tchaikovsky actually finding musical ways to convey what Pushkin did in words. After all, in the novel, Pushkin gives no indication that Lenski is a good poet. On the contrary, he's a young man who is very, very enthusiastic about forms of poetry that Pushkin himself did not approve of. So this Arioso, a teenager pouring out conventional sentiments, how I love you, Olga, to a pretty melody, seems just about right. It seems like the musical version, the kind of, early 19th century Russian pop song version of the type of probably not so great love poetry that Lenski would have provided to Olga if only we had access to it. So, in that sense, again, I think, go Tchaikovsky. This actually works quite well as far as doing musical characterization. But again, I want to circle back to that first Lenski point, which Lenski, I think, is at one end of a sort of sliding scale where he is a very conventionally operatic character. I love his music. He sings, or the tenor that sings him always sings very beautifully. But Lenski's music, again, it's about melody. The melody's in the voice. It's about giving the opportunity for that tenor to display the beauty of the voice. The arias are structured in very predictable ways: introduction, melody, contrast in the middle, return to the original material at the end. Again, this is the sort of stuff that a young opera buff to be can fall in love with without knowing anything else of the opera. Fine, but obviously that's not the only type of thing that we get. Once again, I think it's going to be okay for time. Let's start. We did that already. Let me slip in one more aria. And so this is, again, this is one of my favorite moments in the opera. This is from the third act. It's the aria of Prince Grayman. He is Tatiana's husband, the person, now he's a prince instead of a general, whom Tatiana marries in between Act 2 and Act 3. So Grayman is, again, a Lenski-like character. I mean, first off, he's basically an invention of Tchaikovsky. The general doesn't speak. He barely is mentioned in Pushkin. There's just a fat general mentioned in passing. We hear his spurs at the end. And the text of this aria is almost completely new. The first thought, and only the first thought, comes from Pushkin, but it's not about Prince Grayman or about the fat general. It's about Onegin himself. And this is very much a real aria. Beautiful tune, tunes in the voice. It's a nice ABA structure. We get the tune, then the music speeds up a little bit as the bass starts singing about turmoil in the world and strife between people, and then it settles back down again, and we get the opening melody again. Why? We don't need it. He's telling us stuff that we know already. Well, because we really like it. We want to hear it again. And besides, that's what arias do. You get the same thing at the beginning that you get at the end. So this would be another example of something that's beautiful, it's memorable, but I would say very conventionally operatic, and in that sense, non-Pushkin. So if you're a part of the Tchaikovsky didn't really get Pushkin crowd, that's Exhibit A. It's an episode made up by Tchaikovsky. The poetry is doggerel, and yet it's a wonderful aria. I love it. Again, now that's one type of character, but obviously I haven't gotten to the characters that are much more important, that are much more central to the drama. So let's talk about Tatiana. So we've already discussed how Tchaikovsky identified with, sympathized with her. But despite her major role in the novel, she's present almost constantly, so much revolves around her. There's actually a similar problem to Prince Grayman, which is that there's very little reported speech in Pushkin. So that is, we're hearing about Tatiana all the time, but until the very end of the novel, she doesn't actually speak. She writes a letter, but she doesn't say anything. So if you're trying to construct an aria, you have to find words for her. So how does Tchaikovsky deal with this problem? Well, he makes the big vocal moment for Tatiana the writing of the letter, because we do have a letter, but this is problematic on a number of levels. So first off, just biographically, this is the first thing that Tchaikovsky did, again, by his own account, even before he had gotten a libretto and started composing the opera, he started writing the letter scene. First thing that he did. And so the other problem, which is just a little bit of trivia, is that in the novel itself, the conceit is that the letter is a real object in the possession of the narrator / Pushkin. So Pushkin has it, but he can't share it with us because Tatiana, of course, as an educated Russian, wrote it in French. So again, the conceit of the novel is that we never actually get to read Tatiana's letter. We get a translation of her letter, which the narrator assures us is inferior, and if only we could read the real thing. So this is the kind of literary game that we don't get in the opera at all. And then the other problem, of course, is this is the most famous poetry in the entire novel. If an educated Russian is going to know any portion of the novel, this is the part they will know from memory. So any dissonance between the libretto and the original poem is going to be most obvious at this moment. So Tchaikovsky does something really clever, which is that he constructs a long scene for the soprano. It's about twice as long as anybody else's aria, but it's not really an aria. It's sort of a succession of what I think is more of songs, or as we would say in Russian, romances, separated by recitative. So it's sort of idea, talking about something, idea, talking about something. So I thought we've got enough time to listen to the very beginning of the letter scene. And it's going to go like this. There's going to be an orchestral introduction. And the first thing we're going to hear is a kind of, fairly intense melody in the strings, which if we'd heard the previous scene, we would know is associated with Tatiana's words, to her nurse, "Oh, Nanny, I'm so sad. I feel like breaking out in sobbing." So the orchestra, again, is setting the scene for us, and there's a bunch of kind of agitated orchestral music. And then Tatiana comes in with what I think of as song number one. It's very tuneful, great tune, lovely to hear somebody sing it, but she's not at the letter yet. She's not at Pushkin's poetry yet. She's singing about, oh, I know I shouldn't write, but I feel compelled to. The subtitles are going to be a little different. But again, this is all sort of foreplay. Then she stops, the orchestra plays for a while, and we get the recitative. Then she starts to say, oh, no, I've written something, but I don't like it. I'm going to discard this. And then the orchestra starts up again, and what I think of as song number two. So this is where it gets really interesting, because at this point, Tatiana sits down and starts writing the actual letter that we all know already. So great. So the aria consists of her narrating the letter that she's writing, except, and this is what I think is the really interesting thing, at this point, for me, the character of the music changes completely. It's still beautiful, melodic, romantic Tchaikovsky, but the good stuff's all in the orchestra. And the vocal part, when she was singing about writing, she was so melodic. But now that she's actually writing the letter, she's almost speaking the words. The vocal writing is all in the middle register. It's moving along in a kind of natural speech rhythm. There's no melody to speak of. There's so much gorgeous stuff in the orchestra, I think we don't mind it. But in a way, it's a very reverential setting when we get to the letter itself. It's as if there's sort of big italics. I'm sorry, I shouldn't do the finger thing, but around the stuff that's actually coming out of the Pushkin novel. So here's how it goes in real time. Now the recitative.
Нет, все не то. Начну сначала. Что со мной? Я вся горю. Не знаю, как начать. Как напишу, чего же более? Что я могу еще сказать? Теперь я знаю вашей воле меня презрением наказать. А вы к моей несчастной доле хоть каплю жалости храня, вы не оставите меня. Сначала я молчать хотела, поверьте, моего стыда вы не узнали никогда, никогда.
Okay, so here's the punchline. Let's finally get to Onegin. He's the title character, he's the central character, he's Pushkin's imaginary friend, he's the last romantic lead standing. But he's very problematic as a person, and I think not just for Tchaikovsky. He's what people in mid-19th century Russia would have called a superfluous man, an educated, intelligent man with no place in society, a kind of bored, restless anti-hero. And in Pushkin's novel, he has a real lack of literary voice or sense of self. Lenski may not be a good poet, but Onegin isn't a poet at all. And it's important that he doesn't write. I mean, he writes a letter at the end, but he doesn't write poetry. And then the sense of self. An episode in the novel that doesn't appear in the opera is one in which Tatiana visits Onegin's library in his uncle's estate after Onegin has left it. And Tatiana goes and reads all of Onegin's books. She goes through his books and she considers the possibility that the character she thought was Onegin is just a sort of collection of parodies of elements and characteristics of the figures that he's read about, that there's no there, that he's, he's decent, he's lovable, but he's sort of hollow inside. And Tchaikovsky finds a wonderful way of expressing this. So Onegin too sort of lacks a distinctive musical voice. We could talk a whole thing about the way the voice types are assigned in the opera. Ask me in the Q&A if you're interested in talking about that. But there's one moment when Onegin wishes to express the genuine emotion, and that, of course, is at the very end of the opera when he realizes that he's in love with Tatiana. And so he wants to admit this to himself, and so he says, I am in love with Tatiana. But in the opera, what does he sing? He sings exactly the music that Tatiana sang at the beginning of the letter scene. So that is in the same way that in the novel, Onegin only has access to this sort of collection of gestures and tics from people that he's read about. In the opera, he only has vocal access to melodies that belong to other people. Okay, I think this is going to go 1 minute over, but it's a 2-minute excerpt, and I think it's worth it. So let's hear Sergei Leiferkus as Eugene Onegin singing that very moment. Great. So in conclusion, again, I don't think that fidelity to the literary source should be the measure of an opera's value or success, but I think that Tchaikovsky was a much better reader of Pushkin than he's been given credit for. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much to the San Francisco Opera Guild for having me. And I'd like to welcome back to the virtual stage John Morris.
Thank you so much, Derek. Thank you for joining us. And that was just such a fascinating presentation. And really enjoyed your insights as well as the clips that you selected. And we're going to open it up now to Q&A. We've had some questions come in, and if you would like to ask a question, it's not too late. You can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And our first question is, what other operas did Tchaikovsky compose?
Well, for those of us in the West, I mean, the only two that I've actually seen on stage are Eugene Onegin and the Queen of Spades, which are both fabulous in different ways. I should have studied. I don't really know the complete list. There's an Iolanta, which is wonderful. It's a short opera. It's got a bit in the middle. It sounds just like the gorgeous slow movement from Tchaikovsky's Fifth. There's Joan of Arc, which I'm afraid I only know the big soprano aria with the horn solo. I've never seen or heard the rest of the opera. And then, earlier you get into Vakula the Smith and the Voyeveda, which I'm afraid are are mysteries to me. So I have to admit my lack of expertise there.
Well, no, thank you. And I think we can say that Eugene Onegin is his most famous opera
Yeah.
of the set. That actually relates to a question I have, which is I am an opera fan. I'm also a ballet fan,
Ah,
and I love Swan Lake and Sleeping Beauty and The Nutcracker. And I'm wondering how you would compare contrast the music in Eugene Onegin to those ballets. I mean, different in format, of course, and subject matter, but just your insights there would be interesting to hear.
yeah, I feel as if, ballet allowed Tchaikovsky to sort of unleash his melodic inspiration in a way that somewhat counterintuitively opera didn't always. The demands of setting text and of worrying about poetry and characters actually interacting with each other. Even in to me, just, stunningly beautiful arias for Lenski, for Grayman, it's not a sort of a full-on symmetrical tune of the sort we get in Swan Lake or Sleeping Beauty or something like that. And then again, I think there's much more rain for character pieces. The series of exotic dances in Nutcracker.
Mhm.
I just, it's not that I love all these things in different ways, but I think ballet really brought out certain things in Tchaikovsky that really played to his strengths.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps just because my background is as an orchestra player, and so as an orchestra player, that's when we get all the good tunes.
Absolutely. Agreed. It was interesting your point about lyric scenes, and I'm curious what else. I know you referenced the two letters, two dances, and one duel. I'm curious what else you think about this story lends itself well to opera. I mean, clearly there is romance, and that is sort of throughout. I'm just wondering your thoughts. I mean, from my perspective, there always needs to be sort of an epic quality in opera in some way, shape, or form to make it an opera. And I'm wondering, what in this opera is epic to you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, because one approach would be to say, I mean, a lot of people think of Eugene Onegin essentially as a chamber opera. That his real home would be on the conservatory stage, or something much less elaborate than the San Francisco Opera. And yet, it's so wonderful that it can sustain being sort of inflated a little bit, in the larger stage and the larger gestures. But it sort of, I think, arguably doesn't have that epic quality. It doesn't. And again, I think for some people they find that lacking. For me, there's a kind of intimacy and humanness that perhaps I lose a little bit in the more epic operas. I think in this opera, I really, I mean, Tchaikovsky did get people instead of puppets. I really believe that these people have feelings, and that these feelings are changing, and that they're fairly subtle feelings.
Hmm. Thank you. I'm not sure if all of our attendees have visited the San Francisco Opera, the production page on the website, but I saw this text and I thought it was interesting, and I'm curious your comments on it. When verses from one of Russia's greatest poets come together with music from one of Russia's greatest composers, you're in for a romance on par with the likes of Anna Karenina. And so I'm just curious about that, kind of connecting it with Anna Karenina or comparing it, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I don't want to go sort of too Russian literature nerd, partially because like it's been a really long time since I've studied it formally. But I mean, to a certain extent, bringing together Pushkin, Tchaikovsky, just evaluating them as Russian in no other way, and then tossing in Tolstoy
Hmm.
it's potent but kind of problematic. Look, I did this myself, right? I just sort of flattened things out. I said, oh, Pushkin, very revered in Russian culture, but attitudes towards Pushkin actually changed a lot in the course of the 19th century. At the time, more or less at the time of the opera Eugene Onegin, the novel was rising in prestige, poetry was a little lower, so Pushkin was actually sort of not at the height of his fame from that point of view. And it was right after the opera in 1880 that Dostoevsky gave the famous Pushkin address, in which he kind of reclaimed Pushkin as a sort of more distinctively Russian figure, with Tatiana sort of exemplifying the good Russian woman in a way. And that this sort of turned Pushkin into a more um, national figure, rather. I mean, I feel as if, Pushkin during his lifetime, he's a figure in world poetry. He's very cosmopolitan. Dostoevsky made him more specifically Russian. And then the question of Tchaikovsky's Russian is differently fraught, because during Tchaikovsky's lifetime, he was, by many critics, held up as insufficiently Russian because he was conservatory trained. He'd studied music theory at the Russian Musical Society led by Nikolai Rubinstein. He was one of the first graduate. He's in the first graduating class of the newly opened St. Petersburg Conservatory. He went straight from there to teach at the newly opened Moscow Conservatory. And so for the people that felt that the true Russian composers were Mussorgsky, Borodin, Rimsky-Korsakov, and that crowd, because they were talented amateurs and they were Slavic rather than cosmopolitan and Western, the whole, Tchaikovsky and Pushkin both have this somewhat ambiguous relationship to that historic Slavophile Westernizer divide, and Tolstoy doesn't. We know right where Tolstoy fits.
Thank
So
you.
sorry, that's a long, baggy, not very good answer. Apologies.
Well, no, it all gives interesting texture to this, so thank you. We had one final question come in, and we just have time for one more, which is, how do present day Russians feel about / react to Tchaikovsky being gay?
Well, I can't speak for present day Russians. I'm going to sort of obliquely answer a slightly different question, which is, I think that, the question of Tchaikovsky's sexual orientation is difficult to understand outside of his own cultural context. So, in Tchaikovsky's day, on the one hand, technically speaking, homosexuality was illegal. On the other hand, it was not just widespread and tolerated, but something that was, it was something that was performed in much the way that gay culture, I think, is performed today in ways that be very familiar to us. So this idea of him as a sort of repressed and secretive is really very anachronistic. I think, the time when that was most problematic I think it's not necessarily for audiences or for sort of people writ large, but for scholars. That this has been a big problem for people in my line of work, is that Tchaikovsky's letters and diaries, well, first off, they weren't accessible to scholars at all during the Soviet era, and then when they were made accessible, they're very heavily edited, and so clearly there were people in the archives who were very uncomfortable with Tchaikovsky's openness, and not just about that aspect of his sexuality, but in general in ways that seem sort of, I don't know, undignified or inappropriate for a major cultural figure. But I find it difficult to believe that anybody's troubled by it today.
Thank you. That concludes our Q&A portion. So I would like to welcome back Benjamin Osgood, the Opera Guild's VP of Community Outreach, and welcome Peggy Hill, our Previews Coordinator, Marin Chapter President, and VP of Chapters. I'd like to mention to our audience that this virtual preview is being recorded, and we will put a link on the website, which is sfopera.com/opera previews, to view the recording. And then others can register for the recording, and it's going to be available through October 14th, which is the run of the production. I'll hand it over to you, Peggy.
Okay. Well, thank you, Derek Katz, for this excellent overview and insight into the beautiful opera, Eugene Onegin. And for those opera lovers who cannot attend a live performance, this opera will be live streamed on Saturday, October 1st at 7:30 p.m. Sign up on the San Francisco Opera website. The cost is $27.50. These previews are brought to you by the several Bay Area chapters under the auspices of our San Francisco Opera Guild. And many of these previews are live and in person. However, for those who cannot attend an in-person preview, we have virtual previews of each and every San Francisco opera. The next virtual preview will be on Monday, October 10th at 6 p.m. with Michael Bragg discussing Dialogues of the Carmelites. Sign up on the San Francisco Opera website, and I think John Morris will tell you a little bit more how to do that. And now to say a few final words is our host, Benjamin Osgood.
Thanks, Peggy and John, and thanks, Derek. I was excited to see this opera before, and now I really am. And I think these opera previews are just so valuable and really bring so much more. We get so much more out of it when we come prepared with this knowledge and this history. And your breadth of knowledge is so infectious and impressive. And I loved the dad joke in the beginning, the bar mitzvah joke. So I was laughing. I'm sure I wasn't the only one. And I will. I know we got to wrap things up here, but we do sincerely want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And as John said, it'll be available online until October 14th. And I think you dropped the link in there, but I'll give it to everyone again. It's www.sfopera.com/opera previews. And then to echo Peggy's statement, please mark your calendar for Monday, October 10th at 6 p.m., where our next guest speaker is Michael Bragg, who will lead us through an exploration of Francis Poulenc's profound drama, Dialogues of the Carmelites. And to the Jewish members of our big opera family, Shana Tova, and from everyone here at the San Francisco Opera and Opera Guild, thank you and good night.